Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I am Deepak, your host from India. We are delighted to have distinguished Dr. Kean Birch, Grace Business Talk today, as our esteemed guest. Before we get started, I would like to introduce the guest for today's episode. What happens when data becomes asset and technology giants become landlords of the digital age? Few scholars are better positioned to answer that question than Professor Kean Birch. He is the Ontario Research Chair in Science Policy and a professor in the Department of Science, Technology and Society at York University, Toronto, Canada, where he also served as Director of the Institute for Technoscience and Society. Trained across the University of Edinburgh and Oxford Brookes University, Professor Birch is an interdisciplinary thinker who bridges science and technology studies, economic sociology, and political economy. His groundbreaking work on assetization, how things like knowledge, data, and digital platforms are converted into rent-extracting assets, has shaped debates on big tech, digital monopolies, and the future of innovation. He's the co-editor of Science as Culture, a leading international STS journal, and the founder and series editor of the Technoscience and Society book series at the University of Toronto Press. His notable books include Data Enclaves and the open access MIT Press volume Assetization, Turning Things into Assets in Technoscientific Capitalism. A visiting scholar at Copenhagen Business School and the Technical University of Munich, Professor Birch brings a truly global lens to the political economy of emerging technologies from AI and blockchain to digital finance. In today's episode, we are truly privileged to sit down with Dr. Kean Birch, who takes us on a fascinating journey deep into the heart of his compelling new book, Assetization, Turning Things into Assets in Techno-Scientific Capitalism. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kean Birch to the conversation. Professor Kean, your graceful acceptance of our invitation means a great deal to us, and it is with an immense honor and delight to welcome you on Business Talk.
Deepak, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for inviting me on.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, the book argues that the dominant form of contemporary capitalism is no longer the commodity, but the asset. Can you walk us through why this distinction matters and what it changes about how we understand companies like Uber, Airbnb, or Google?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it starts out as a kind of puzzle that I was facing um, maybe 10, 15 years ago, where I was doing research on the biotech industry, the life science industry, and I was looking at the sector and the global sector and seeing that there's 4,000 odd companies in the global biotech sector, and out of those 4,000, only a handful, well, not maybe not more than a handful, but 15, 20 firms were actually profitable. And the sector had been going for quite a while, but it, as a sector as a whole, had not been profitable until I think about 2009. And so that was what I found really interesting, because I was like, well, I started thinking, why is that the case? And why are people still investing and still putting money into this sector that's not making money? And how might we understand what it is that people value there, instead of it being the kind of sale of products and services, pharmaceutical drugs, that sort of thing. What is it that keeps people coming back with their investments and wanting to invest more? And thinking through that kind of puzzle, I landed on assets, and primarily with the biotech life science sector, intellectual property is the kind of key kind of asset. And this is the thing that everyone was investing money in these companies in order to um, uh, I guess acquire or capture, right? So and that, for them, the people who are investing, that was the thing of value for them, was the intellectual property. And then subsequently, I started thinking about other kinds of sectors, and so a bit less than 10 years ago, probably 7, 8 years ago, I started thinking about digital data, because it was the time, I think it was just after the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And I was thinking about, well, what makes data valuable, and what makes data a resource, and how might we think of it as an asset again? And so I did the same sort of thing, thinking through how we might understand data as an asset, and other kinds of puzzles or complexities popped up. One of them being, well, if data is an asset, where does it sit on companies' balance sheets? And actually, it doesn't. You don't see it on companies' balance sheets, and companies don't seem very bothered about putting it on their balance sheets. But everyone talks about data being the resource base of 21st century, economies. And so, where is it sit, and or where do we find it, and how do we understand what data is and measure it, and how do we then value it, and so on. So that got me thinking about data, thinking about, well, maybe if we can't find it on the balance sheet, we can find it somewhere else within the operations of the mainly big tech companies that I was looking at. So, Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. Where do they kind of, where's the value that people see in those companies, and then how might we identify that value and measure that as the data and the value of that data that they hold, and how do we understand the monetization of that data through different kinds of business models that these companies have. I'm most recently now interested in tokenization, so how blockchain distributed ledger technologies are being used in order to transform all sorts of different things into assets, from wine to collectible cars to watches, luxury watches, to gold, to stable coins, all these sorts of things that are now being thought of. So that's been, I guess, my journey when it comes to thinking through assetization and what it means. Yeah.
Professor, define assetization as the process of turning things into assets, things that can be owned, controlled, and capitalized as a future revenue stream. How is this different from simply commodifying something? And why does that difference matter for policymakers and business leaders?
Sure. Yeah, so it is an interesting point. So how do we differentiate, or how do we understand and define what an asset is? And of different people have different notions of what an asset is. For many people, an asset is their home or their car or even their education. People talk a lot about human capital. Um, for others, the asset is, it can be a bit more abstract. It could be, the kind of natural resource endowment that a country has, or it could be even the environmental, conditions in a country. So you have natural capital accounting and so on. In accounting terms, an asset is defined as, now I'm not sure I will get this correct, but it's defined by the International Accounting Standards Board as something like an economic resource from which an entity gains future benefits, and an economic resource is defined as a right that has the potential to lead to these future benefits. So in accounting terms, an asset has many kinds of qualities. It can be owned or controlled by an entity. It has to generate these future benefits over a period of time, and these future benefits, often entail different kinds of rights to things, and so they could be a contractual right to mineral resources that are buried underground, or things like that. The main difference then between a commodity and an asset is that a commodity is something that is, it's an object that's been turned into something for sale. And so that's what defines a commodity. It's something that has been turned into something for sale, while an asset is an object that generates these future revenues. So with a commodity, you want to sell it, and then you would get a return from selling it, and that's whether that is a product or a service that you are selling and you're generating, and you make money from that. With an asset, you want to hold on to it, and you want to hold on to it and generate future revenues from holding on to it, turn it into something, or use it to transform other things into things that you can sell, and you capture those revenues through your ownership and your control over the asset itself. Yeah, so that would be, I guess, the main kind of differentiation that I would make there between a commodity and an asset.
Professor, the book identifies 7 distinctive features of the asset form, from legal constructs and retirership to dynamic valuation. Which of these do you think is most misunderstood by mainstream economists and business executives today?
Um, I'm not sure if they're misunderstood. I think there's probably different kinds of priorities that different business people have in terms of what they're trying to do. I think um, it does depend on what your strategic outlook is, I think, and what you're trying to do. I think what we see generally is over the last, I would say, yeah, 10 years, 20 years, is a shift away or shift towards um, business strategies that are about extending or exerting control and ownership over resources, as opposed to this, uh, development of new products or development of products and services in order to sell them as commodities, for example. The aim is to ensure that you can capture as much as as much future revenue as you can through your ownership and control of resources. So I think that's the kind of key kind of sort of transformation, if you like, of business strategy, business models, and such like. And we can see it in we can see it in different companies. Something that is companies like we could say a company, ride sharing companies, their aim is to try and capture an existing, market, the taxi market, and to try and capture as much as that as possible through their kind of business models and technological arrangement, configuration, and exert their, ownership and control over that, um, you know, business area, that market. You could look at other kinds of business segments as well, and you could think of social media. The aim there with social media companies is to exert control over the ecosystem, that social media ecosystem, in order to extract as much, as much revenues and value as they can from that social media ecosystem. And so that means exerting control over um, the kind of users, developers, the data, the technologies, and so on that exists within the ecosystem.
Professor, one chapter reveals that nearly 75% of patents are never licensed, cited, or used, yet they are still treated as a valuable assets. What does this tell us about the real function of intellectual property in modern business strategy?
Yeah, so IP, intellectual property, is a fascinating topic, and I think that patents are one of those one aspect of it that are especially fascinating because they're supposed to be the incentive to innovate, that companies, that encourages companies to innovate and to create new technologies and new products and services. That's their kind of expected function. They're, expected, the reason that we have patents is to provide that incentive. So the fact that, we can learn, that a considerable proportion or majority of patents aren't really, used in the sense of leading to directly leading to a product or service is interesting. And I think a lot of the times patents and other intellectual property are often part of a sort of defensive strategy. So most of the time, um, the reason for IP is to protect the development of, of the products and services that you want to sell. And this requires not just simply one piece of IP. It requires a family of IP or a portfolio of IP, and so you need to protect all sorts of areas of it. And so that's the way that a lot of patents work. Is you have a family or portfolio of patents that help you defend your I guess your business position. And a secondary part of it is um, become in a secondary element of this is that I think over the last sort of 20 years, 25 years, as a consequence of this, the kind of rising concern with, a so-called knowledge economy, or now a data-driven economy, um, IP has become an important revenue source. So people will develop IP, and you can see this especially in a sector like the biotech sector or life sciences sector. Companies would develop IP, and that could be, it could be all sorts of different things. It might be a drug target, or it might be a a diagnostic, or it might be a some form of I don't know, biomarker, something. It's something that could contribute to the development of a product. Um, and this has value, but a lot of the times, as small companies, or as companies funded by venture capitalists, they have to be very focused. And so if you develop something, you have to focus on two or three maximum um, innovation pathways, and the rest, what do you do with it? And so for a lot of companies, small companies in these innovative sectors, what they realize is that you can sell your IP, and people will buy the IP, and then you can fund the R&D pathways that you've chosen to follow. And what's interesting is that interesting and kind of problematic is that there are companies in the world who will buy the IP whose objective is simply to own IP and to sue other companies that might potentially infringe on their IP and to make money out of that. And so they have a wonderful name. They're called patent trolls. The idea being that it's the myth of the troll that sits under the bridge, demanding people pay them a toll if they want to go across the bridge. And it's the same here. You have people who sit on the IP and they demand a toll if you want to use, or if you're getting very close to their IP. And sometimes it's easier just to pay them off than it is to go through the court process. So there's a very interesting world of people who sit on this IP. This is also, I think, extended further. It's not just the life sciences, biotech sector. It's extended further into, as we become more digitalized, and as data has become more important, as content has become more important. There's a number of, I think, business, but again, there's ways to kind of capture value from this IP that doesn't entail creating new products and services. It is, copyright claims. You can, put a copyright claim in when someone, potentially infringes on IP on a social network site like YouTube, for example. YouTubers are constantly complaining about IP, copyright strikes, right? So they have to watch out for what kind of music they might play or videos, clips they might show, because someone could put a copyright strike on them and immediately claim any revenues that they generate from that video. So the same sort of thing, just it's another kind of example of it.
Professor, the book traces how personal data went from a byproduct of digital activity to a core financial asset, what you call data sets. How do corporations actually activate data into revenue streams? And what power do individuals really have over their own data?
Right. So that's the chapter by Thomas Beauvisage and Kevin Millet, who are writing about the online advertising world. And this is fascinating, and part of what sort of led me to an interest in digital data after the life science and the work on life sciences and biotech. So it's really interesting because digital data has all these kinds of qualities to it that make it seem like it would be very difficult to turn it into an asset, to make it some property of somebody, because it's data is easy to share. It's easy for multiple people to use it at once. You using it doesn't stop me from using it. And it's pretty costless to share. It's pretty costless. It seems costless to produce. It isn't, I don't think, but there's all these kind of qualities to it that make it a really interesting thing. What the big tech companies have done is they managed to transform digital data into this resource, this asset, through various different kinds of business models. One of the primary ones that people are interested in is the online advertising business model. And so you have famous books like Shoshana Zuboff's Surveillance Capitalism, and other books by other authors. I think another well-known one by Nick Chernicek called Platform Capitalism, where they're very concerned with they're writing about this kind of these business models, and writing about the ways that these platforms, these ecosystems, are able to generate revenues from holding these data assets. And so, I looked at it, and as I said earlier, it's very difficult to actually identify the data assets on their balance sheets. They don't really exist. Even if you look at their earnings calls or their, financial reports, they're not really talking about data as an asset. What they talk about is they're very interested in users and user engagement and these sorts of things, and they're very, very focused on measuring how many users they have. And so part of the way that you have to understand this data assets and their value to these companies by understanding how they go about measuring or understanding, what is the value here. And the value, as I said, is the users and user engagement. So they're really interested in kind of metrics that measure this, various kinds of standards that are established to measure what counts as an impression on a website, right? So and how do you create the kind of technological architecture that enables you to do this measurement and then transform that measurement into something valuable. So there are different dimensions to it. There's the measurement. There's also the technological architecture and ecosystem that they create in order to generate more engagement, to get more users into their ecosystem, and to expand their ecosystem to enroll more and more, other businesses or governments into, feeding in users traffic, as Google calls it, into their ecosystems. And what they end up doing is they end up creating these, what I call these data enclaves, which is these ecosystems in which they control the technology, they control the rules of how we operate on the in their ecosystem. They control all sorts of different products and so on, a suite of products that is tied into attracting all this traffic into their ecosystem, and then they monetize it. And they monetize, it's one of the major ways of monetizing is through online advertising, and this is classic for Google and not Microsoft, sorry, Facebook. These are two companies who are essentially advertising companies. Google used to make until recently about 80% of its revenues from online advertising, and Facebook is something like 95 to 97%. Enormous amount of their revenues come from online advertising. And if you look at their online advertising, if you kind of try and unpack online advertising to try and take it apart and to understand all the different, I guess, entities, the different kind of products and services that are part of this online advertising system, it's incredibly complex. On one side, you have a set of companies who are, the publishers, websites, news media companies, app developers who are, all trying to attract users, and by attracting users, they can they need to measure how many users they have. They need to measure how much engagement these users do on their website, the kind of impressions, click-throughs, all that sort of thing. So those publishers on one side. On the other side, you have the advertisers who are looking to find users to advertise to. And in between, you have this array of very, quite diverse companies who are doing different things within this advertising technology or ad tech sector. So there might be companies that are, that run the advertising for the, that sort of automate the advertising for the advertisers, or automate the selling for the publishers. There are companies that data management companies that sell data to these ad I can't remember what they're called right now, but they're like the ad I think supply side platforms and buy side platforms. So these platforms that help the publishers and advertisers operate. And then they all meet in the middle with the ad exchange, which then, that's as as you open a website, for example, in that very short time, less than a second, a lot of stuff is going on in the background where the advertisers are trying to find the segment that they want to advertise to, and they will bid on this ad exchange in order to do that. And it's fascinating, it's complicated, and what you realize after a while is that a company like Google essentially is just stretched across all those intermediaries between the publishers and the advertisers, and plays a role in all sorts of different kinds of entities there. And so it has this very strong market dominance. And it lost a case about this last year, I think, in the US, right? So the Department of Justice brought a case against them for monopolization, which it lost. But yeah, fascinating kind of will.
Professor, there's a striking contradiction in the book. Advances in science are bringing curative therapies closer than ever. Yet, the assetization of biomedicine may be making cures structurally undesirable for companies. How does the financial logic of shareholder value actively work against cures?
Yeah, so I think this is another chapter in the book by someone called Victor Roy, who's written about capitalizing cures, and he's written a book as well. And I think the book's called Capitalizing Cures. The chapter might be called something else, but he's very much interested in this this issue of um, what does it mean when a company gets more value from um, pursuing a drug developments for chronic conditions, ongoing chronic conditions, rather than acute conditions that require cures or that could be cured. So as a as a system, we can think of this kind of incentive structure that we have based on the ownership and control of assets and the generation of revenues that you can then capitalize, and that determines the value of your company or the value of the drug that can be sold to another company. That has an unfortunate side effect of sort of derailing the whole point of the incentive for innovation, providing this short-term monopoly through a patent, because it drives companies to look for, as I mentioned, look for chronic illnesses that they can generate repeat revenues from, rather than cures that to alleviate diseases that can be cured. Now, I think this is the downside of assetization, and you can generally see it, I think, across a lot of we can see increasingly, I think, a lot across a lot of different sectors, these problems that emerge when we have it becomes more valuable to generate these repeated revenues rather than to develop new kinds of products and services that solve our problems, our world problems, if you like. And I think we could see different kinds of examples of this, and some of them are ridiculous. My favorite is a company that went bankrupt called Juicero, Juicero, which was a Silicon Valley based company that um, received about $120 million worth of venture capital investment, and its product was a juicer, a fruit juicer that you can get smoothies from, and the juicer itself cost about $400 or something like that after a discount. But the way that they envisaged making money was selling juice packs. And so the juice packs, you would buy the juice packs, you'd put it in the juicer, pull a lever, and the juice would come out of the juice pack and you'd drink it. People realized quite quickly that actually, if you just used your hand and squeezed the juice pack, the juice would come out, and there's no point for the juicer itself. And the company didn't really survive. It went bankrupt, and yeah. So I think we can look at other examples of this kind of ways that companies are trying to turn a one-off purchase of a product or a service into a continuing revenue stream, and the problems with this, and we can see it in things like ebooks or streaming or subscriptions, or all these sorts of things that have become more and more commonplace. There are car companies that have made car seat heating a subscription service. That's because it generates more revenue for them than selling off one-off car. Ebooks, you can buy them from companies like Amazon, and they're not they're not really so much cheaper than a hard copy of the book. But if you read the terms and conditions of the Kindle e-reader, um, basically you don't own that. Whatever you bought, it's basically a license from Amazon, and Amazon can turn off that or end that license at will if they so choose. And sometimes this leads to this leads to problems of obsolescence, where an e-reader might become obsolescent, and the company is not going to invest any more money in updating it, upgrading it, and you end up with a kind of a brick in a sense. You've got an e-reader that no longer works, and you've paid all this money for these books that you've got, or whatever it is that you've got. So there's this kind of shift towards these kinds of business models. I think is it's part of this problem of this. How do we understand what is valuable here, and how do we govern that kind of value? Yeah.
Professor, the book includes a case study on the English higher education shifting from being a public good to a public asset. Is this trend reversible, and what would it mean for societies that are currently undergoing rapid privatization of education, as we see in India and elsewhere?
Yeah, so I think so. Within the book, it's talking about two authors, Daniel Nyland and Sveta Milieva, talking about specifically about student debt, and so the ways that student debt gets turned into this asset. I think this is a broad kind of issue. It's not just student debt. There's also issues around educational technology, or ed tech, and the ways that these companies, they're trying to um, um, essentially trying to kind of insert their way into the operations of a university, and primarily to extract data, or to collect data for often for other purposes. Um, and I think this is pretty ubiquitous nowadays at universities. So most universities have forms of they use different kinds of digital platforms for delivering student teaching, or for student learning, so teaching, delivering teaching, or what have you. They also, universities have also become reliant on companies to provide their computing needs, whether that's email, or whether that's servers, or computing capacity, cloud computing, etc. So across if we look behind the front, the facade of a university, a lot of the operations going on in a university are now undertaken by, not by the university anymore, but undertaken by other companies, that private companies. I think that there's dangers here in terms of how you um, how you manage that, and how you set up, how you, as a university, how you arrange that kind of setup. And some of them relate to getting locked in to a particular service provider, or becoming dependent upon a particular kind of service. And there are different kinds of services and service providers that you could look at, where the companies aren't able to, universities aren't able to shift from one company, providing them their service, say their email service, to another company without spending a lot of money to do so. And this this generates then as I said, it locks universities in, and it generates kind of problems for the university, as they are unable to negotiate and to find competitors, and find alternatives down the line.
Professor, one chapter examines how recidivists, rough sleepers, and the unemployed are being turned into financial assets through social impact bonds. At what point does impact investing cross a line, and who bears the risk when these bonds fail?
Yeah, so I think this is, this is a chapter by James Williams about social impact bonds. And the basic idea is that you kind of turn over social welfare delivery to the private sector, and they get paid on the basis of a set of sort of metrics, that they have to achieve, and if they don't achieve them, they don't get paid. And so the whole idea is that they should be able to, they have a better incentive to reduce, to kind of improve the welfare situation of people, whether it's homeless people or whether it's um, people who've just been released from prison and are at risk of recidivism, as it's called, so repeat offending and so on. So the idea is that you provide the incentive for these companies to improve welfare. I think the problem is it's very easy for these companies when it comes to impact investing, very easy for these companies to basically walk away, right? If it doesn't work out, you can walk away and you can leave the mess for others to sort out. And usually the mess is has to be sorted out by government, and the cost then becomes a public cost that we as citizens, residents, taxpayers, whatever you want to call us, we end up having to pay.
Professor, the book introduces the concept of rentireship, extracting economic rent through ownership and control rather than through productive activity. Do you think today's most celebrated tech entrepreneurs are actually rentier in disguise? Or how would you draw that line?
Yeah, so the idea of rentiership for me, actually, it wasn't just in this book. I wrote about it as well outside of this book, where I did a project called From Entrepreneurship to Rentiership. So I was looking at again different kinds of technology sectors and looking at the ways that this shift from the creation of new kinds of development and sale of new kinds of products and services has been replaced by this search for for ways to extend ownership and control over kind of societal resources. And so I was kind of thinking about this as this notion of rentiership as a way of rentiership is about extracting value from ownership and control rather than from the sale of useful products and services. So that was my kind of way of trying to think through this difference between them. And part of getting at this notion of rentiership was then thinking through how innovation has changed and the ways that innovation is not always a social good. It is often framed as this entirely good, socially good thing, but actually there are different forms of innovation. And so there's good, there's bad, there's ugly innovation. And I came up with this notion of parasitic innovation, which is innovation that I can't remember now if I mentioned that earlier on, but it's types of innovation that is designed specifically to put an extra toll in between us and the world so that we have to now start paying for things that we didn't used to pay for things, or to extract value from to divert the value that somebody's already generating and creating and to divert it into your company instead, or to externalize the costs of something so that the public has to take care of it and pay for those costs and you don't have to, and you benefit that way. And so there's different ways of thinking about this kind of parasitic innovation, and I've already mentioned some of it, but there are other kinds of things that you could think of where again, we've got companies, printer companies that they make a lot of their money from ink rather than from actually selling the printer. And so what they do is they design their printers to become bricks, to brick themselves if they get generic ink put in them, right? And things like that, where you update your printer and suddenly it becomes useless because you've been using a cheaper generic ink. So that kind of thing where you're innovating to make things more difficult for consumers, for users, and by doing that, you extract more revenue from them, basically.
Professor, in your concluding chapter, you map out the future of assetization as a field. Given everything that has happened with AI, generative models, and data ownership, since the book was published, what new frontiers of assetization worries or excite you most?
Yeah, so I think there's I've already mentioned tokenization as well, what I'm interested in, and I think that's a more recent interest, the last 2 or 3 years. And part of that is to do with, it's interesting, but it's also worrying in the sense that it's interesting because you can look at the ways that people are trying to transform all sorts of different things into assets, but it's worrying in the sense that you can transform all sorts of things into assets, and you may not want to. The flip side of that is that actually, if we think about assets, we may want to think through ways that we can protect the societal resources, natural resources, etc., that we value, and that might mean we can, collectively, as a through political processes and so on, create forms of what I think of as kind of like sovereign wealth funds, where I come up with the idea of a data wealth fund. So instead of it being natural resources like oil or gas or what have you, you can use, countries could collect, aggregate their data that they generate. We generate all sorts of different, all sorts of data, and every country generates enormous amount of data, all sorts of different data that has enormous amount of value. So we collect it all together and we generate revenues from it that can be used in ways that are socially, collectively beneficial. So there's different kinds of elements to this which are, worrying in a sense of how do we govern societies now that have become increasingly assetized, but also the potential to kind of flip it and try and find new ways to govern societal resources that enables us to do things in a way that generate revenues for countries and peoples. Yep.
Professor, our audience would love to hear from you about the Forest 2026 conference happening in Toronto this October. Could you share some details about it?
Sure. So that, as you can see on my screen, is there's a conference called the it's a conference put on by a learned society called the Society for the Social Studies of Science, so 4S. And it's an annual conference that the society runs every year, obviously, because it's annual. And this year it's in Toronto, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the conference alongside colleagues, Alison Harvey and Sergio Sismondo. There's a whole team of people involved, so it's not just us three. There's a range of people who are all involved. And yeah, it's in October, and an enormous amount of research going to be discussed at the conference. I think we have over 3,000 participants who have submitted some abstract or other kinds of activity, and we're all very interested in the social, political, economic kind of drivers or forces behind science, technology, and innovation, and the ways then that science, technology, innovation impacts society.
Thank you, Professor. Listeners, that brings us to the end of today's conversation. And what a thought-provoking one it has been. The idea that we are no longer living in a world driven by commodities, but by assets, and that everything from our data to our universities to our very social problems is being turned into a revenue stream, is both unsettling and deeply important to understand. As business leaders, policymakers, and citizens, the question we must carry forward is this: who controls the assets, controls the future? And it is up to all of us to decide what kind of future that should be. Thank you so much, Professor Kean Birch, for joining us on Business Talk. If today's
Um,
episode made you think differently about capitalism, listeners, value, and the world around you, do share it with your network. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep the conversation going. Thank you so much, Professor Kean Birch.
Thank you, Deepak.